this series, everyone. All the people who have joined, we are really, really thankful for you. Now, when we talk about Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, one name always pops up, and that is Rana Mams. And you may know her from Twitter, but some of us know her all the way back in like 2011 when she started the Forum Shire. And if you go on talking to her about her books, then they range from Tales from Quran and Hadith, which is a really, really wonderful book to give to children, for example, if you wish to educate your children about ethics and principles as per the Quran and Hadith. A gift that I have personally gifted to my niece as well. And other than that, she has also translated one of Sayyid's most seminal works, and that is Asar Sanadid. It was originally in Urdu. She translated it back into English. So Rana Ma'am has always been at the forefront of harmony. She has always been there talking about how it is important to move hand in hand with India's Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. And once we talk about this particular book that we are going to be talking about today is The Forgotten Cities of Delhi and Shah Jahanabad, the living city of Old Delhi. So it basically captures a very weird juxtaposition. Weird, I think, would be the wrong word. I think it would be curious. That's the right word here. And it's a very curious juxtaposition of modernity and some sort of old tehzeeb that is prevalent in the city of Delhi. And of course, for that, we have none other than Lubna Abba here, Lubna Irfan. She has also been their former secretary. She's currently like a faculty at the Department of History. So we are really, really, it's like a really, really big pleasure for me to introduce both of you at the same time. So thank you so much for being here. Let's just move on.
Thank you, Abdullah, for the detailed introduction of Rana ma'am. Definitely, when you talk about Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, Rana ma'am is like, Rana Appa's name comes up like, in the top few people who talk about that. Today, we are going to talk about her book. We are going to discuss not just the book, we are going to discuss the writing, we are going to discuss women writers, and also women in history. Right? I had a discussion with Rana ma'am, and that is how we decided to chalk out this session. Briefly giving an overview. Yeah. Rana ma'am's work is elaborate and extensive. But there are three books on Delhi itself are the prominent books that have been published by Rana Safari. One of them is Shah Jahanabad, the living city of Delhi, and it is the latest book in a trilogy, which happens to include Where Stones Speak, The Forgotten Cities of Delhi, and Shah Jahanabad. So, Rana ma'am, my first question to you would be regarding this only. Uh, Please, if you will be, kind enough to give us an overview of your books, especially in context of Delhi, and what was your inspiration? Why did you decide to write a trilogy like this? What was the idea? What was your idea behind it?
Thank you, Lubna. And first of all, I'd like to thank the AMU Literary and Debating Society for inviting me. When I was studying there, I used to be a very active debater. And like Lubna, I was also the secretary of the Sultania Historical Society. And it's always a pleasure to be connected to the students of my alma mater. And to come back to Delhi, Delhi was never a city to which I belonged. I was born in Aligarh. I studied in Aligarh. My schooling was done in Lucknow, and I was living in the Middle East. But I started visiting Delhi from 2012 when my daughter was working here, and at that point of time, I realized that there's not enough material. That Delhi is so rich. It's historically, apart from all the dynasties and the history of it, it's also very rich in monuments. The art history of Delhi is extremely rich. And I realized it had not been really documented after 1919. 1919 is when you have the monuments of Delhi by Maulvi Zafar Hasan. Then you have Maulvi Bashiruddin Ahmad's book, Waqiyat-e Darul Hukumat-e Delhi. But after that, the books that were on Delhi were not as comprehensive. I won't say that nothing was written on Delhi. Many books are written on Delhi, but they weren't as comprehensive as that. So initially I thought I'd write a book, something like Gordon Hahn's The Seven Cities of Delhi. And, one book and it would cover everything. And that is how naive I was. And when I went into Mehrauli, I realized that Mehrauli itself had over 50 monuments. And so that's when I decided to make it into a trilogy. So first of all, of course, Mehrauli, I did archival research, apart from which I did a lot of field research and a lot of oral history. So that is how, and because I've been reading Asanu Sanadi, I've been reading Waqiyat Darul Hukumat Delhi. So I saw that the way the Urdu writers, and this is something that I grew up with also, that because at every given point of time, my mother would quote some shairi or she would quote some English verses. So, that was a part of our consciousness and our growing up. So that's what I tried to weave into my book also, that I gave one photograph and that photograph was described by a verse instead of by describing it in prose. So that became, something that I brought into I should say, history writing of monuments. That I try to weave in everything. The Shire platform that I had started, my history interest, my heritage interest, everything I try to weave in together and make it a very lively history, a narrative history which everybody could relate, not something which becomes restricted to just a few people. Especially because I feel that it's only when we start connecting with our history and with our heritage that ownership of monuments will come. Until ownership of monuments does not come, we will never look after it. Because for us, I remember, once I had hired a taxi and I had gone to Firozshah Kotla and he was there with me for a day. And I told him, I said, okay, why don't you also come inside? And he said, Madam, Khandaro mein jaake koi kya karega? So, that kind of attitude that people have, I wanted to dispel that by telling stories so that actually the khandars come live for you. And then you realize, oh, this is where this happened, this particular incident happened here. And then you want to actually go in and explore.
That's really, really interesting. Because you are also, you're just not talking about, say, monuments, like खंडर. आप खाली खंडरों की बात नहीं कर रहे, आप खंडरों में एक तरीके से जान फूक रहे हैं, because you're, recreating the life that was lived in those spaces. So my next question, or just, the points to take the discussion forward would be, when you talk about a living city or a living monument, right, or a living history, or, history that comes alive through these discussions. So, what is your idea about that? And is there any notion of bringing back or reviving some kind of cultural life that is fading away? Because for most people, Delhi today is not the historical monument. Delhi is a number of things for a number of people, but not the historical monuments like we historians see. So, are you trying to reach out to a broader audience? Or to a larger audience and kind of revive some of this past or recreate some of this past so that they can live it? What is your notion? What is your idea?
So, first of all, I'll come to the title of the book, The Living City of Old Delhi. Now, Mehroli is a living city. People who have lived there from 800 AD, they're still living there in the same streets, in the same gullies. The rest of Delhi, which is covered in the forgotten cities of Delhi, I have, I think, about 300 to 400 monuments in that. Those monuments are no longer living monuments. They are badly, some of them are encroached, some of them are looked after by, they're not listed in the ASI. So they like the particular group of monuments in Zawaratpur, in that it's Kawadi Walas are living in one portion, cattle are in another portion, एक portion जो है उसको चारों तरफ से घेर लिया है, उसमें घर बने हुए एक में कपड़े सूखते हैं, so like that kind of thing. So I wanted to present to people who think of this as a maybe a place to hang clothes, that ये कभी किसी का मकबरा था, यहाँ पे लोग रहते थे. So then when I come to Shahjahanabad, people are still occupying those same places. So it's very much a living city. It's not a city which is just like, as I said, Zamarutpur में वो monuments में कोई रहता नहीं है. लेकिन शाहजहानाबाद के बहुत से monuments में, बहुत सी पुरानी हवेलियों में people are still staying. So it's very much a living city. And that's what I wanted to bring, that, when we talk of history, it's when we talk of monuments, it's not only the past, it's also the present, it's also the afterlife of the monuments. So I wanted to bring all these, क्योंकि बहुत दफे ये डिबेट होता है कि भाई हम किसकी फिक्र करें, जो यहाँ पे दफन है और जो चले गए, या वो जो जिंदा है और अभी रह रहे हैं. Whose history is it?
Because there's always this clash. There's always a lack of faith, and if you're going to protect the monuments, while protecting monuments is one thing, but people who are alive and giving space, to them to live, survive, that's also an issue. So in Shahjahanabad, you're saying that the people who were originally inhabitants of the
Yes.
city, successors or descendants of those people are still in the places that were there. And also the places like, because you mentioned in your book, the market, the Faiz Bazaar, the Chandni Chowk, right? They're still the markets that are there, right? They were originally the markets and they're still the markets. So, in addition to all of this, since we're talking about women and women writers, so I would want to bring in the angle of women who contributed to the city of Shahjahanabad to have expertise on that. So, I would like you to make people aware of who were these women, what was their contribution.
So most people actually think that Mughal women were sitting behind the parda in the harem and they were there only for the enjoyment of the emperor, which is absolutely wrong. They were very powerful women, whether they were the wives or the dowager empresses, the daughters, the sisters, whoever they were all very powerful women with a lot of money in their hands. And when Shah Jahanabad was being planned, that is, orders were given in 1639 and 1648 is when द जिसको कहते हैं ना कि वो जलवा अफरोज हुए बादशाह जो थे महल के अंदर तो between that time a lot of construction was done not only in the Red Fort but also in the cities and areas were given to the people the nobles the family of the emperor to build and construct. Now, today, Jama Masjid is the iconic thing. If you go to Shahjahanabad and everybody will ask you, have you gone to Jama Masjid? But in 1648, when Shahjahanabad was ready and it was populated by the people and the royal family, there was no Jama Masjid. The Jama Masjid of that time, the place where people went for congregation was Fatehpuri Masjid. And it is these three masjids that were the most important masjids of the time and all three made by women. Akbarabadi Masjid, which जो बाद में शहीद हो गई 1857 में, Fatehpuri Masjid and Sirhandi Masjid. All these three were wives of Shah Jahan. And as you know, Akbar had made this policy of the wife being named after the city of their origin. So they were called like Akbarabadi Begum was from Akbarabad or Agra. So the masjid is called Akbarabadi Masjid, then Fatehpuri Masjid, then Sarhandi Masjid. Even today, the Sarhandi Masjid is still very much functioning, as is of course Fatehpuri. But let's talk of Sarhandi first. Sarhandi Masjid, when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan goes to check on it in 1847, his book comes out. He said that there's nothing very beautiful about this mosque, but it's very strong and sturdy. And maybe that is why it survives even today because, there's a railway track running just behind it. The facade has been very, severely curtailed. There's a madrasa running inside it. And people there did not know who Sarhindi Begum was. They said कि शाहजहां ने शायद अपनी बीवी के नाम पे रख दिया इसका नाम. When I said नहीं ये तो बीवी ने ही बनाई थी. So how patriarchy works in India. They were all very surprised that a woman had that kind of power that she could build such a lofty and such a huge masjid, and that also such an important one. And then, of course, Fatehpuri Masjid occupied then and occupies now a very important place. It's second only to Jama Masjid, and its Imam is a very, very progressive person. And Fatehpuri Masjid played a big role even in 1857, as did the other masjids. Then you have Zinatul Masajid, which was made by Aurangzeb's daughter. You have in just outside the Red Fort, you have a Sunehri Masjid made by Qudsiya Begum, the wife of Muhammad Shah, mother of Ahmad Shah. She made it in her son's reign. She made a garden, Qudsiya Bagh, and then there's another Kanis Fatma who made a mosque for her husband. We keep talking of the Taj Mahal being made by the husband for the wife, but Kanis Fatma made this masjid is called Fakhrul Masajid in the memory of her husband who had died. He was a soldier in the Mughal army, officer in the Mughal army, and he died, and she made it to commemorate her husband. So, there are so many monuments made by women. Just in Shahjahanabad itself, I'm not talking of the whole of Delhi. Then we come to the most important woman of her times, the richest of her times also, Jahan Ara Begum, who today, of course, sleeps in a very, small, very simple grave open to the sun, as was her will in Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. But she is the one who made Chandni Chowk, she made a Begum Ki Sarai, which could have rivaled any fanciest of fancy hotels today. The Sarai was for travelers who came, for ambassadors, merchants, everybody who came. Then Begum Ka Bagh, and the important, you can imagine how important Begum Ka Bagh was. It was renamed Queen's Garden after Queen Victoria, and then is now Mahatma Gandhi, named after Mahatma Gandhi. That was the importance of that bagh. She made a hammam, which was again destroyed in 1857. And all this, that entire stretch is stamped with the name of women. It's just that we, very conveniently forget. So,
conveniently forgotten. Like a memory or a history that people do not want to acknowledge, maybe. Because I also have seen Jahanara days, and it is also not in a very good shape. Maybe we should, do something about it, create awareness, and some heritage walk maybe conducted, right? Delhi Illusion or like that.
yes,
Take us to the places where women built and have.
शाहजहानाबाद में ही एक छोटी सी कब्र में
Exactly.
unknown, मतलब not, I should not say unknown, but in the sense that people hardly know that it exists, there is Sultan Razia. And we remember the film Hema Malini and Dharminder, but we do not know that the actual Razia is where she is lying. So for us, when we say Razia, we think of Hema Malini and Dharminder. So that is, it is these kind of things which I want to bring back to public consciousness, historical consciousness. That these are women, these are men who lived, who have contributed so much to the land that we are living in. It's Delhi is the palimpsest.
That's exactly. They've been made and remade time and again, and from every time we have a token to remember Delhi by. Moving ahead, one thing that exactly one thing that I wanted to tell the audience is that they can put up questions in the chat box. Some of them might be taken up in the end for Rana ma'am to answer. Right. I'll take this discussion to from women builders. I'll take this discussion to something that Old Delhi or Shahjahanabad, as we know it today, is known, right? It is known for its food. So I will, what have you seen, or you have been, conducting surveys. So what is the food culture? How much of the original Shahjahanabad food culture is reflected in today's, kebabs and chicken and shirmal and everything that Old Delhi boasts of?
The food that we find in Old Delhi now, I don't think it is anywhere near the food that was eaten at that time. Because at that time, a lot of do pyaza, kalyas, these are what were eaten. Pulaus were eaten. But today, like it's famous, in that Bazme Akhir, which is written in 1885, and in Nuskha Shah Jahan, which is written during the reign of Shah Jahan, we don't find references to say biryani or to the kind of food that is being sold under the name of Mughlai cuisine. So I would say that anyway, food also evolves. So and कहीं तो मुगल याद रहते हैं सबको, इसलिए खाने पे तो बहुत ही जरूरी याद होते हैं. But बज़्म आखिर I have described, मतलब Munshi Faizuddin has described the Dastarkhan of Bahadur Shah Zafar, which I have tried to trace each and every dish that he has listed there in the appendix. Like, he talks of, Gauzaban, that means an oval shaped tandoor roti. Then he talks of Naan Punabba, which is probably bread. Bread is being introduced. So, the pav has come in through the Portuguese. So, there are, a lot of cultural cross connections also, which come through food. And when in 1947 the refugees came, so they brought their own food with them. So now we see what a lot of food that we see in Shahjahanabad now is assimilation and I should say a mixture of a lot of foods that were brought by people who came here and settled here.
Okay, thank you so much, Anand. I will be moving towards last two questions that I have in this question. One question is that I have, I rose from the discussion that we are having, that when we are talking about preserving, because we are talking about preserving the heritage. So how do we include the local communities in the process of preservation,
So you see the
heritage preservation, building preservation? Heritage not just monuments culture.
You see, monuments are very similar to, say, let's talk about forest reserves. Now, in forest reserves, when the villagers were living inside the forest reserve, they were later on displaced and told to leave the forest, and they are now been relocated outside. When they were living inside the forest reserve, they had their own ways, own tribal ways, old ways of somehow or the other, managing the ecology of the place. It's the same thing for a monument. When people who are connected to it are living beside it, they will manage it, they will look after it, they will have some feelings for it. But Delhi saw two very huge, very two catastrophes, one in 1857, one in 1947, when there was a displacement of population. In 1857, you see that the old landed population of Delhi leave and go away, and then they are hounded and come back only 10 years later. And by the time they come, a lot of the monuments have already been broken by the British, who are trying to redesign it to make it more convenient for troop movement. In 1947, you see so many people leaving and going to Pakistan, another set of people coming and living here. Now, till there is no connect between the person and the monument, how does it matter to them? It's like you going living in your house, looking after it, and you living in a stranger's house or say in a hotel room. You don't bother, like if tea will spill on my floor, I will immediately wipe it. If it falls on a hotel floor, I'll think chodo kya hai, wo to saaf karega hi subah. So it's that. And this is something that is also, when ASI was formed, the monuments became owned by the state. uh, all the monuments are now owned by the states, the ones that are listed, of course, the central list or state list or whatever. So, in a way, it is good because they're looking after it and preserving it, but then they have cut away the people from it also. So, like there is one mosque in Mubarakpur, Kotla, and I know it because the ASI CA in charge told me. He said हम हर हफ्ते जाते हैं और वहाँ से सफाई करवाते हैं उस मस्जिद में. That masjid is surrounded by from all sides. None of these mosques are functioning, so it's become a kind of a dump because it's very convenient. There are houses all over, so it's easiest to throw rubbish from upstairs. Nobody realizes it's a a mosque. For them, it's just a pile of stones. It's just khandar. So they use it very conveniently as a dumping ground. So if there was some consciousness or there were some people who were connected with that mosque, who had prayed in that mosque, if they were living around, they would have definitely looked after it. So that's what I mean to say that when you have a connect with something, you want to look after it, and that is the kind of connect I'm trying to make through my books. That like when I say, okay, maybe Sultan Razia stood here, so people will okay, in their mind they will see something and they'll say, okay, this is an important place. Or if I say Shah Jahan stood here, Jahanara stood here, it becomes a little more you become a little more connected to it. So yes, I'm writing narrative history. It's not academic, but what I'm writing is for for popular consumption and to increase popular consciousness.
And that is very, very important because you're serving the cause of history in a very big way because people do not know about history and it is important to for them to read it and your books are being read, mashallah. Okay, I come to the last question that there is from my side. We are talking about women writers, and I'm sure in the audience there are a number of women who are aspiring writers, budding writers. So, what is your advice to them or suggestion to them on how to go about their projects, how to start writing, start publishing?
See, first of all, is that writing needs to have passion. It's the passion that shows through. It's my passion which shows through my writing when I'm talking, whatever I'm doing. You have to be passionate. Don't write because you think that it's a good thing to do. Write about if you're good at writing, take up a subject which you are passionate about. For me, I could have written about many things, but I'm passionate about monuments, so I wrote about monuments. I did not, even now there are, I get offers that why don't you write on this particular subject or that particular aspect of history. But I'm so passionate about monument that for me, I can't stay away from that. So I want to keep writing about that and, discovering new aspects. Every time, even for my books which I've written, I suddenly discover, okay, why I did not cover this part of it. So maybe next time I will try and include another aspect to it. So there's so much to keep discovering. And for the writers here, the women writers especially, go for subjects which you are passionate about. Once you realize what you want to write, be very methodical. It is a lot of hard work. It's not, like you can't just say, I've got a writer's block. Even the days when I don't feel like writing, I still make it a point to write 1,000 words. And that is something I learned from Mr. Khushwant Singh. I have never met him, I've only read him. But I know that he used to say that I sit and write 1,000 words every day. So it becomes your habit. And then even if you have a writer's block and things are not flowing, so then what I'll do is I'll keep noting and keep writing down points that, okay, I'll come back to this point where I'm stuck just now. Let me go on to whatever is flowing and then come back. And then, things do work out in the end. So it's not as if you've got a permanent writer's block. It's just that at that particular point of time, for maybe one particular subject, you are not being able to think. So just write a few points there and move on. Don't keep trying to push something which is not coming to you. Let it come to you easily, because when it comes to you easily, you'll write easily, and the person who's reading it will also find it an easy read. And like I feel that especially when you're writing for a popular audience, your words should be such that they can read it without having to refer to the dictionary. Because my audience is not the type who's going to be maybe my audience is not going to be the type who's going to, keep referring to dictionaries or have a historical awareness. So I keep that in mind. Keep in mind, whoever is your audience, who are you writing for? Are you writing for girls, for boys, for teenagers, for adults, for heritage enthusiasts? You're writing for academic journals. Mold yourself and your writing according to that. If I was to write for an academic journal, I would write it very differently from the way I write it here. And please do write and follow your passions, and don't feel that it's I have to do this, I have to do that. Everybody has so many things to do, so you carry on with everything and your life as well as your passion.
Really great advice. Thank you so much, ma'am. I will be stopping the questions and the discussion from this side. I'm sure there are a number of questions from the audience. So we will be taking up a few of them. The UDLC team will be coordinating questions to take up, because Rana ma'am has taken out time from a very stressful time that she's going through, and she has still taken out time. I'm really really thankful to her for giving us time, for giving us this, sharing her ideas, sharing her knowledge. Thank you so much from the deepest quarters of my heart. Just a few more questions from the audiences, and then we can conclude the session. Shabir,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
coordinating the questions
Yeah,
from the audience.
Abdullah will be doing it. Abdullah will be coordinating the questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have the good fortune of being here for the second time. And Rana ma'am, I really, really appreciate your time. I'm pretty sure Alumna Appa herself is very busy. And thank you once again to all the audience that is here. I would be taking like a few questions that people have sent in. So I see some from Raza Hedazeri. And he says that, man, we know that a lot of Shah Jahanabad's population moved to Lucknow. What was their impact on Awadhi culture?
That's a very interesting question. So the movement was mainly in 39 and 67 after the raid of Ahmad Shah Abdali and Nadir Shah, mainly Ahmad Shah Abdali in 1769. So I think 1769, if I'm not wrong. Maybe the year is 1 or 2 years here or there. But anyway, so when they went to Lucknow, Lucknow was already a very thriving and a very rich culture. So Lucknow culture is still very different from Mughal. So I would not say that the Mughals, the people who went from here, had a very big impact on. I have not studied that aspect, so I'm just talking off the cuff. I may be wrong also, but from having grown up in Lucknow and having read a lot of books on Awadh culture, I would say that Awadh has its own culture, whether it is food. And now let's talk about food and monuments, which are the two things I work on. If you see the Awadh monuments, they are stucco. They are not marble and red stone, which is what you will find in Delhi. Because the marble and red sandstone is difficult to acquire in Lucknow. So they make with lakhari bricks, they use lime plaster, and all the decoration is in stucco. As far as food is concerned, the taste in Lucknow is very delicate. जिसको कहते हैं ना एक नजाकत है वहाँ के खाने में, जो लखनऊ में दिल्ली के खाने में नहीं है. मैं बिरयानी की ही अगर बात करूं तो लखनऊ में बासमती की बिरयानी बनेगी और यहाँ बिरयानी बनती ही नहीं, वहां तो यखनी पुलाव बनता है और यहाँ पे जो बनता है वो सेला चावल का बनता है. सो मुगल cuisine of that time was very robust, whereas the cuisine of Lucknow, the Awadhi cuisine, developed under the influence of Persian influence. It has that certain subtlety of flavors. आप अगर यहाँ की बिरयानी खाएंगे और लखनऊ का यखनी पुलाव खाएंगे तो आपको फौरन समझ में आ जाएगा कि कौन पका रहा है, क्योंकि जो एक उसका फ्लेवरफुल होता है ना, कि बहुत सटल अंडरटोन्स होते हैं इन यखनी पुलाव. एंड वो अब्दुल हलीम शरण कहते हैं कि कुकिंग अ बिरयानी इज वेरी इजी. इट्स डिफिकल्ट टू स्पॉइल अ बिरयानी, बट इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू कुक अ गुड यखनी पुलाव. तो बस यही है फर्क. सो आई वुड नॉट से दैट देयर वाज टू मच ऑफ एन इम्पैक्ट of the people who went from Mughal Delhi to the Nawabi Lucknow. And this again, as I said, I have not studied it. I'm just comparing two things which I do know about.
Yep, definitely, Rana ma'am. Thank you very much for that. Now, ma'am, we have a question right here from Hazar Khan, and that is that we have heard the topic from a female perspective, but what do you think was the role of eunuchs in Mughal era?
अरे दे वर वेरी वेरी इन्फ्लुएंशियल. उनको बहुत ज्यादा क्या कहते हैं, एक तो ख्वाजा सरा कहलाते थे वो, और उसके बाद जैसे बहादुर शाह जफर के जो वजीर थे महबूब खान, ही वाज अ यूनक. वी टॉक्ड ऑफ कुत्सिया बेगम. उनके जमाने में जावेद खान करके एक यूनक थे जो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट थे, जिन कुत्सिया बाग एज वेल एज दिस सुनहरी मस्जिद वर बोथ कंस्ट्रक्टेड अंडर हिज सुपरविजन. सो दे गार्डेड द harem, the zanana, were guarded by the eunuchs. They were always there. They were painters, generals, Malik Ambar. Sorry, I don't think Malik Ambar was a eunuch. I'm sorry about that. Not that. So sorry. So as I said, Mehboob Khan थे, and ये थे क्या कहते हैं, जावेद खान थे. अगर आप वहाँ जाएं तो in Mehroli there is a very big Hijron ki Khanka made for the Khwaja Saras. So all these things, they had a very respected and respectable status of, and they were given as per. अच्छा देखिए, एक meritocracy थी in the Mughal administration, that they recognized merit. It did not matter कि आप ऊंचे हैं नीचे हैं, मतलब I mean class, कि whether you are from a rich family or you are from a a lower income family, they recognized your meritocracy and they did not see कि आप की जात पात कुछ नहीं. It was dependent on how the thing you were, competent you were. And Mehboob Khan जो वो थे, and he's called Mehboob Khan Khwaja Sara जो वजीर थे. In fact, he died just while the siege of Delhi was on. He died in, I think, July 1857, and then he was succeeded by Hakim Ehsanullah Khan. So इनकी बहुत important role थी. जावेद खान की बहुत important role थी. But again, आपके अलीगढ़ में है शादाब बानो, she's the one who's studying this. So I think she would be the best person to answer, because she has written, in fact, I refer to her papers when I need to know something about that. I refer to Professor Shadab's papers on eunuchs.
Thank you so much, Rana ma'am.
Another thing was the Abyssinian. Abyssinians जो थे, they also held very important positions. Like Malik Ambar was an Abyssinian जिनके जहांगीर के छक्के छुड़ा दिए थे कि you have that famous painting where he's trying to aim an arrow at Malik Ambar's head. So these people, it wasn't आज हम लोग बहुत ज़्यादा, we have become so how should I say, racist भी हो गए हैं हम कहीं ना कहीं. We have become a little communal also, but it wasn't like that then. Mm-hmm. It depended on your merit. Of course, there were prejudices, but their prejudices were different.
Definitely, ma'am. Definitely. I'm trying to run through questions as quickly as I can because I understand time bahut kam hai. I'd be taking one more question. Then I think that the first question we received was from Muhammad Adnan Khan, and he wanted to ask that how do you think accounts of old Delhi, such as Mehrauli and Shah Jahanabad, in books have evolved in the past century? As in, how has the perspective of looking at monuments changed over the century? Perhaps it's referring to the last century.
When, as I said, I had read Gordon Hawn's The Seven Cities of Delhi. So when I read that, it's written from a colonial point of view. He talks of कि 1857 में यहाँ इसको ये हुआ. So they are writing a colonial history. He writes, there is another book, The Fort of Delhi by Sanderson, where he just very casually says, there was a Hira Mahal here, and it was removed because it stopped the flow of air to the barracks. Now, Hira Mahal is something that is made part of the original Shahjahanabad. It was part of the Nehre Barish. It was a white marble pavilion. But very casually he writes it was removed. Now, if when I am writing it in my book, when you read it, I am lamenting that it has been removed. So that is how perspectives change, because for me it is something that's important. For him it was just something that it stops the flow of air. So it depends on which way you are looking at it. Now when the Maulvi Bashiruddin Ahmad is writing, or when let's say Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is writing a Saruf Sanadid, when he goes to inspect अब्दुल रहीम खाने खाना's tomb, and he sees कि वहाँ जो नीचे की जो लेवल है उसमें जहाँ पे एक्चुअल क्रिप्ट है वहाँ पे गाय भैंसे बंधी हुई हैं, एंड ही सेज कि जिनके दीवान खाने में मनो गुलाब के फूल होते थे वहाँ पे आज इस वक्त मतलब ही आई एम पैराफ्रेजिंग इट बिकॉज हिज लैंग्वेज इज ऑफ कोर्स मच मोर एलिगेंट दैट वन आई कैन से so he says कि there is a stench over here and it's stinking, and so then he keeps saying the warning that is given in the Quran that everything is temporary. So his point of view is this, that somebody who lived so grandly is now reduced to this, that cattle are living in his grave, in the area where the grave crypt is. So, and he says, if only we would heed, if only we would heed. And that is something that I have to, imbibe from Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. When I go to tombs and I see कि किस तरह से उनकी इतनी बुरी हालत है, बुरी गत हो रही है, मुझे लगता है ना कि मट्टी में कब्र होती तो वो बेहतर था.
My goodness, that is definitely one very verbose answer, one answer that really enlightens you about the conditions that the graves are in. And again, sadly, we are. Yeah.
घर बन गए हैं उसके अंदर, एक टूम के अंदर जैसे वो 12 लाओ का गुंबद अपना खाली करवा दिया गया. देयर वाज अ फैमिली लिविंग इनसाइड इट, उन्होंने उसको इलेक्ट्रीफाई कर लिया, उसमें पिंक पेंट कर लिया. इन दिस आई एम फॉरगेटिंग द एग्जैक्ट, मालविया नगर के आसपास है शेख सलाहुद्दीन दरवेश की मजार. उसमें उनकी मजार तो खैर चलो खुली हुई है, उसमें इतना बुरा हाल नहीं है, लेकिन उसके पास 3 और कब्रें हैं टूम जिसमें लोग रह रहे हैं. एक में कबाड़ भरा हुआ था, हम लोग ने फिर खोल खोल के हर चीज देखी, बिकॉज व्हेन आई वाज राइटिंग फॉरगॉटन सिटीज आई वेंट एंड इन्वेस्टिगेटेड इट. सो लाइक तो कब्रें तो कहीं है ही नहीं. आप इफ यू सी भूल भुलैया जो आदम खान की टूम है, in I think in one of these English accounts, I think it's a page where he writes that the cenotaph had been removed, or when it's made into a guest house, they removed the cenotaph. In Dilkusha, which was Quli Khan's grave, the cenotaph is being used as a dining table. So I feel it's better कि भैया आप जमीन में दफन थे तो
Yeah,
वही
definitely,
बेहतर था.
definitely, Rana ma'am. And of
Somebody
course,
eat dinner over your grave.
oh God. Yeah, definitely. So this has of course been like an interesting discussion, and I would definitely want it to extend for longer, but we are like everything bounded by time. And thank you once again to Lubna Appa for being here. Thank you once again, Rana ma'am, for being here. And I would like to invite Saeed Imad to give like a word of thanks. Once again, Rana ma'am, thank you so much from UDLC's, and we look forward to having you offline in Aligarh once again.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lubna.
No,
Okay,
and thank you
am I
so
audible? Sabi, can you
much
just
for your
confirm?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ima, we can go forward, please.
Honorable guest, ma'am, Rana Sabvi, Dr. Sadaf Farid, ma'am, President UDLC, Dr. Lubna Irfan, former Secretary UDLC and Assistant Professor, Women's College, and all my dear friends. A warm good evening to everyone. I, Sayyid Imad Hussain, on behalf of the entire club, take this opportunity to thank our esteemed guest, Mr. Rana Safi ma'am, Mrs. Rana Safi ma'am, for taking out time and enlightening us with insightful words. I express my gratitude to all our participants. I extend my gratitude to our president, Dr. Sadaf Farid ma'am, who couldn't join due to unforeseeable circumstances, for conceptualizing this event's idea. I must thank our very own Dr. Lubna Apa, our moderator today, and the organizing team as well as the entire UDLC team for making this event a success. So that would be all for the evening. Thank you all for joining us. See you soon.
Thank you so
Thank
so
you.
much for joining. That would be all from our